Hey, welcome to the psychodynamic approach. So, Freud's theory. Cover quite a few things in this lecture. Ego defenses, psychosexual stages, conscious mind, unconscious mind, etc. So let's get into it. So, these are the core assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. So, Freud um, worked mainly in Vienna with middle-class white Vietnamese women and had several case studies as well. Um, he was good friends with Carl Jung, and then they split. And Carl Jung went his separate way and developed his own theories about the collective unconscious, unus mundus, synchronicity, etc. So the core assumptions of the psychodynamic approach is that our behaviors are driven by the unconscious mind. So it's below our level of awareness. So unconscious thoughts, feelings can influence behavior. It's a bit like the iceberg analogy. We only see the tip of the iceberg, and most of the iceberg is hidden below the surface of the water. Psychic determinism. So Freud believed that free will was an illusion, and nothing happens by chance. Everything is rooted in the unconscious. So if you ever had the experience of what's called a Freudian slip, where you say something, it kind of slips out. You didn't mean to say it. He called this a Freudian slip, slip of the tongue. It's basically slipping through from the unconscious. And a lot of the assumption is based on early childhood experiences, trauma, difficulties, things like that, that can lead to later problems in life. So people can get fixated in a certain stage, for example, or end up with anxiety disorders or depression or things like that. Okay, structure of personality. So there's three parts to personality structure: the id, the ego, and the superego. So it's called a tripartite model. So the id is what we're born with. It's kind of like it wants instant gratification, the pleasure principle. The ego then develops, and this is the reality principle, and the superego is morality principle. Now, the theory is that the id that wants things and the superego that has your morals, the ego is kind of a referee between the id and the superego who are in conflict with each other. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. So, like I say, the id is the instinctual part that wants things, wants instant gratification. So if the baby's hungry, thirsty, etc., it's just going to cry and just wants to be fed or wants a drink, say, for example. The ego, as the rational part, operates in the reality principle, and it's kind of a mediation between the id and the superego. The superego is the morality principle, so this contains the conscience, punishment, and the ego ideal reward system, and it's basically enforcing morals, our behaviors. So think of it as like the angel and the devil on your shoulder, and the ego is the referee. Levels of consciousness. So, like I say, the consciousness is the tip of the iceberg. Just below the surface is the pre-conscious, and the deepest part is the unconscious. So, the conscious mind is thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that we're currently aware of. Only a small amount is conscious. The pre-conscious is not currently in our awareness, but is easily retrievable, like memories you can think about, you can access. Whereas the unconscious mind is unaccessible. This is where unacceptable social impulses, say, or traumatic events are kept. And the idea is that this part of our mind is driving most of our behavior. We're just not aware of it. Now, there is a way to access the unconscious mind through what's called free association or dream interpretation, which are therapeutic techniques. And the theory is that the only way to kind of change behavior is if you can bring the unconscious issues or conflicts to the conscious, so then you can change them. Otherwise, you're not aware of why you're doing what you're doing because it's all unconsciously driven. So psychosexual stages. So the theory is you have the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency, and the genital stage. The oral stage is where the id is formed, the anal stage for the ego, and the phallic stage for the superego. And within the phallic stage is the Oedipus and Electra complex. So each of these is characterized by a focus on specific erogenous zones, and they progress through these stages, which is driven by the libido or sexual energy. And difficulties at different stages can affect your adult personality. So if you get stuck in the oral stage, maybe you like smoking, say. Anal retentive, people talk about tight arses, things like that. So this is if you have problems with potty training, you could be too generous or you could be too stingy. So the oral stage is the first stage. Focus on pleasure through sucking and feeding. And like I say, fixation may lead to oral personalities such as dependence, gullible, biting, aggression. And over-gratification can lead to optimism and dependency, while under-gratification may produce pessimism and envy. The anal stage, 1 to 3, focuses on the bowel and bladder control, like going to the toilet. Conflicts over toilet training can lead to being anal retentive, could be obsessively tidy or stubborn, or anal expulsive, could be messy and wasteful. The phallic stage is where the focus is on the genitals and emergence of the Oedipus and Electra complex. And resolution involves identifying with the same-sex parent. If you get fixated in this, it can lead to vanity, exhibitionism, and sexual issues. And this is where the superego develops. So the idea for the Oedipus complex is where the boy has sexual feelings towards the mother, fears his father's going to castrate him and kind of hates his father. But then as he gets older and goes through the stages, he realizes that he can't have access to the mother and then aligns with his father's morals, values. The latency stage is 6 to 12. This is where sexual impulses are repressed and the focus shifts to social and intellectual development, same-sex friendships, etc. But it's not considered a true psychosexual stage, but a period of dormancy. And finally, the genital stage, where the focus is on the genitals, and successful resolution of the earlier stages leads to healthy adult relationships. Now, Electra complex is what Carl Jung came up with, because Freud only came up with the Oedipus complex for boys. So the theory is there that girls have penis envy because they realize they haven't got a penis, and they align with their mother to resolve this problem, and a baby is a substitute for a penis. Now, there is a theory that I did hear about called womb envy, where men start a business, and that's a baby substitute. So this talks about the Oedipus and Electra complex. So during the phallic stage, Freud argued that boys develop this sort of sexual desire for the mother. This creates castration anxiety, fear that the father is going to punish them and castrate them. And to resolve that, they repress their feelings for the mother and identify with the father. So this is a quote from Carl Jung. His Majesty the baby feels his power curtailed when he discovers that Daddy is a privileged interloper in respect to Mummy. Interesting quote by Carl Jung there. Electrocomplex, those there for girls. We develop an unconscious sexual desire for the father and jealousy towards the mother. Girls allegedly experience penis envy, this unconscious sense of deprivation when discovering the lack of male genitalia. And this resolves when the girls identify with their mothers and redirect their affection towards more appropriate male figures. Freud's own position on this was that female development was more complex, suggesting that girls blame their mothers for the lack of a penis, temporarily shifting affection to the fathers before eventually identifying with their mothers as they recognized the impossibility of their desires. So these are two Freudian and Carl Jung concepts, really. Ego defenses. So ego defenses are basically ways of protecting yourself and dealing with anxieties and uncomfortable feelings. So when the ego encounters anxiety arising from the conflict between the id and superego, you've got these unconscious psychological strategies called ego defenses. So, for example, denial is one where people deny something to protect themselves. Repression, which is basically pushing painful thoughts and feelings away because you don't want to think about it. So, for example, the soldier unable to recall the trauma that they've experienced. Displacement, which is where you take your anger out on something else or an alternative object. So you have a bad day at work and you get home and kick the dog. There's quite a few of these. Regression is reverting back to an early stage in childhood. So an older child might begin to wet the bed after the birth of a sibling, say. So there are quite a few ego defenses. You probably see these in people if when you look at the behaviour. Reaction formation is a good one. Adopting beliefs or behaviours opposite to one's true feelings. Projection. So that's a bit like the thief calling someone else a thief. So you attribute your own unacceptable thoughts and feelings onto others. So these are ways of dealing with anxieties, really, and these are the conflicts. Psychodynamic research methods, so case studies, you've got famous case studies, Little Hans. Little Hans developed a phobia of horses, which he basically displaced the fear of his father onto as a horse, a lot like his father, and it was more of an acceptable kind of object. Dream interpretation, dream analysis. So you can study people's dreams and look at the manifest content and the latent content. So the latent content is how the dream manifests, and the latent content is the hidden meaning behind the dream, and the manifest content is how the dream manifests itself. So you can study the symbolic element of dreams, so dreams are basically in symbolic form to protect your ego. So you can study the dreams and see what the unconscious kind of message is. Freud talks about wish fulfillment in dreams. Free association is basically where you just say whatever word comes to mind without censorship, and Freud would then analyze those things, look for maybe patterns and connections through your thoughts. So this is a famous case study, Little Hans, had a phobia of horses, and Freud argued that he was going through the Oedipus conflict due to castration anxiety, and the horse symbolized his father. This allegedly provides evidence for the Oedipus complex. But again, it's a case study, it's idiographic, it's hard to generalize. And there could have been some researcher bias, possibly. Dora, Freud, 1905, case study, 18-year-old girl with various hysterical symptoms. Freud interpreted these as resulting from repressed sexual conflicts And the case is controversial because Dora terminated therapy early, and feminist critics argue that Freud failed to recognize the real trauma of sexual harassment she had experienced. Neuropsychoanalysis, combining neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and studies have found that repression correlates with specific patterns of brain activity, potentially providing neurobiological support for defense mechanisms. Now, this is interesting because originally the id, ego, and superego have been sort of thought to be hypothetical constructs. So if they could find neuro evidence for that, that'd be quite interesting. And then you've obviously got modern research, for example, studies on priming, implicit memory, maybe provide evidence for unconscious influence on behavior. And research on attachment theory develops Freud's emphasis on early relationships. Applications. So you've got clinical psychoanalysis. If you ever want to visit Freud's old house, it's in Finchley in North London. Freud Museum. It's worth going there. Check it out. Got a good shop in there as well. So classic methods in this were free association, dream analysis, and transference interpretation. The criticism of psychoanalysis is that it takes a long time and it can be expensive. Brief psychodynamic therapy, although it's typically 12 to 40 sessions, more focused on specific problems and often more interactive than classical psychoanalysis. So you've got some key therapeutic techniques here, working through so the process of repeatedly addressing and reinterpreting defenses and resistances until lasting changes occur. Interpretation, so that the therapist would interpret what was hidden kind of behind the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Catharsis, the release of repressed emotions, often leading to relief and insight. So a lot of people who are angry or have maybe unconscious issues may take up aggressive sports, say, because it feels like a release. It's cathartic. And you also got to be aware of a transference analysis, so examining how the client's feelings towards important people in their lives are projected onto the therapist. So, psychodynamic therapy has been applied to lots of conditions, including depression, anxiety, personality, and trauma. Psychodynamic approach is what's called a grand theory, because it has kind of an explanation for everything. So, the NICE guidelines in the UK recommend psychodynamic approaches for certain conditions, such as dynamic interpersonal therapy for depression. So there is a place for psychoanalysis, but like I say, it is expensive and it can take a long time. So the pros and cons of the psychodynamic approach. I think the emphasis is on childhood, maybe childhood trauma. That could be maybe a good explanation for why people are behaving certain ways, or they've got mental health issues. That maybe they've repressed traumatic events, say, for example. Therapeutic applications have led to helping many people through the therapeutic approaches. And its explanatory power provides a comprehensive explanation for seemingly irrational behaviors like dreams and psychological symptoms. The downside is it could be deterministic, might underestimate human capacity for conscious choice, because it doesn't really agree with the idea of free will. Freud argued free will is an illusion. But he did say that, I think he said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Another limitation is it's got limited testability. A lot of the concept, the hypothetical constructs, which are to prove right or wrong. So in a way, it's kind of unfalsifiable. and the cultural and gender bias. A lot of his patients were white middle class Vietnamese women, so maybe you can't generalize to everybody. And with a case study, say of little hands, you can't generalize that to everybody either. So it kind of uses idiographic research and makes nomothetic claims. So, how is it relevant? So you've got the brief dynamic, which is a time-limited focus therapy. You've got the neuropsychoanalysis, looking at brain research, which is interesting because it's kind of more scientific. Trauma-informed, safety-focused therapeutic care, and the links with attachment theory, looking at how early bonds affect later relationships. So, although a lot of ideas have been modified or rejected by psychology, the psychodynamic approach continues to evolve and contribute to our understanding of human behavior. So if you are looking at a kind of alternative approach to this, and look at the humanistic approach, which is on another video. So thanks for watching, and hope you learned something about psychoanalysis.